Good evening and welcome to Global Crossroads, the program where we dissect the world's most pressing dilemmas. The climate crisis presents an existential threat, yet the path to a solution is fraught with complex questions of fairness and responsibility. Tonight we tackle a particularly contentious issue. Should developing countries be exempt from binding climate change targets? On one side of the debate, we have Ananya Sharma, a distinguished development economist whose work focuses on equitable growth in emerging nations. She argues that imposing stringent targets on these countries is not only unjust but counterproductive to global development. On the other side, we have Dr. Kenji Tanaka, a renowned climate scientist and a key delegate for the Global Environmental Council. He contends that the laws of physics are indifferent to economics, and that universal participation is the only pragmatic way to avert a planetary catastrophe. We will begin with opening statements, followed by a moderated discussion, and conclude with closing remarks. Ms. Sharma, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Thorne. The premise of this debate is predicated on a fundamentally flawed notion of equality that ignores history. The principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities isn't just a piece of jargon. It is the cornerstone of climate justice. Let us be unequivocal. The atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases we face today is overwhelmingly the product of 2 centuries of industrialization by a handful of nations. These countries constructed their vast wealth on a foundation of unfettered fossil fuel consumption, a luxury the developing world was never afforded. To now turn to nations that are just beginning their development journey and demand they shoulder an equal burden is a profound and unacceptable injustice. The developmental imperative for countries across Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America is not an abstract concept. It's about providing electricity to homes that have never had it. It's about ensuring food security in the face of increasingly erratic weather and building the basic infrastructure required to lift millions out of abject poverty, forcing them to divert scarce capital from these essential life-altering goals to costly green energy transitions without massive unconditional support is to condemn them to a perpetual cycle of underdevelopment. We must remember that their per capita emissions remain a mere fraction of those in the developed world, a fact that is often conveniently overlooked in these discussions. Furthermore, we must address the glaring and persistent gap in technology and finance. The developed world has repeatedly and demonstrably fallen short of its own modest pledges, such as the $100 billion annual climate fund promised over a decade ago. Without a genuine large-scale transfer of both capital and green technology, asking developing nations to meet stringent targets is like asking someone to build a house without providing them with bricks or mortar. Therefore, exemption is not a license to pollute, it is a pragmatic and ethical necessity. It allows these nations the policy space to grow sustainably, while the historical polluters finally lead the charge they initiated and from which they have profited immensely.
Dr. Thorne, thank you. Ms. Sharma's argument for justice is compelling, but it tragically collides with the unforgiving realities of atmospheric science. The climate does not negotiate. It does not recognize borders or economic status. It responds only to the total concentration of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere, regardless of their national origin. While historical emissions are an undeniable fact, the trajectory of future emissions makes this a moot point if our collective goal is survival. Projections from every major climate modeling agency are clear. By mid-century, the majority of new emissions will originate from today's developing economies. If this bloc, representing a vast portion of the world's population and future economic growth, is exempt from binding targets, we mathematically forfeit any chance of keeping global warming below the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold. It is not a political statement. It's a matter of simple arithmetic. Secondly, this approach of selective exemption creates a perverse incentive known as, quote, carbon leakage. Industries facing strict regulations and carbon pricing in Europe or North America will have a powerful financial motive to relocate their operations to countries with no emissions caps. The result is a zero-sum game. No net reduction in global emissions, merely a shuffling of the source from one continent to another. This simultaneously undermines the economic competitiveness of nations that are taking responsible action, punishing them for their efforts. Most importantly, this entire debate is framed by a false dichotomy that pits economic development against climate action. This is a 20th century mindset being erroneously applied to a 21st century problem. We are on the cusp of a green industrial revolution. For developing nations, this is a golden opportunity to leapfrog the inefficient, polluting, and centralized development models of the past. Investing in decentralized solar grids, sustainable agriculture, and green public transport can create domestic jobs, enhance energy independence, and dramatically improve public health by reducing air pollution. The solution is not exemption, but an intelligent framework of ambitious yet differentiated and fully supported commitments for all nations. Inaction, whether from historic polluters or emerging economies, is a luxury that no one, rich or poor, can afford any longer.
Thank you both for those powerful opening statements. Dr. Tanaka, I'd like to begin the discussion with you. Ms. Sharma has raised the crucial issue of historical culpability and economic disparity. How do you ethically justify asking a nation with a per capita GDP of perhaps $2,000 to invest in expensive green technology when the problem was largely created by nations with a per capita GDP of over $50,000?
It's a valid and profoundly challenging question, Dr. Thorne. The justification cannot be rooted in blame, as that leads to paralysis. It must be rooted in the concept of shared vulnerability and mutual survival. A drought in the Sahel, intensified by climate change, is not a distant problem. It triggers migration, resource scarcity, and geopolitical instability that affects us all, morally and strategically. Therefore, the ethical framework must shift from retrospective blame to prospective survival. The focus should not be on punitive measures for the developing world, but on a massive, coordinated effort, a green Marshall Plan, if you will, to facilitate a global transition. Developed nations have an absolute moral obligation to fund the lion's share of this transition. That is non-negotiable. But this funding must be tied to clear, binding commitments from all parties to ensure the resources are effectively used to verifiably reduce emissions. Without universal commitment, the investment is wasted, and we all suffer the consequences.
If I may, Dr. Thorne. What Dr. Tanaka eloquently describes as a quote, green Marshall Plan remains a fantasy in the eyes of the global South. The reality on the ground is that promised funds are rarely delivered as grants. They are often structured as loans, sometimes at concessional rates, but loans nonetheless, which further indebt developing nations. These funds frequently come with geopolitical strings attached, dictating policy and undermining national sovereignty. And above all, they are woefully, insultingly insufficient. We talk of billions when the true cost of transition is in the trillions. Until the developed world demonstrates its seriousness by meeting and vastly exceeding its financial promises, any discussion of binding targets for the developing world is premature and disingenuous. It's asking for a firm commitment in exchange for a hollow promise.
Ms. Sharma, let me turn to you. Dr. Tanaka's point about the sheer scale of future emissions is a stark one. If large, rapidly growing economies like India, Nigeria, Indonesia, or Brazil have no binding targets, does that not make a mockery of the efforts made by others? Does it not render the entire Paris Agreement effectively useless? A symbolic gesture on a sinking ship? Aren't you, by extension, advocating for a path that, while perhaps just in principle, leads to collective failure in practice?
I am not advocating for inaction. I am advocating for a different kind of action, an approach grounded in reality and fairness. The focus for developing nations should be on nationally determined contributions that prioritize adaptation to the climate change that is already happening. They must focus on sustainable land use, preventing deforestation, and adopting leapfrogging technologies where it is economically viable. The quoted quote, "A binding nature of the agreement should first be on the developed world to provide the necessary funding for these actions. Once a robust, reliable, and substantial system of financial and technological support is in place, and has been for years, then we can evolve the conversation about what developing nations can commit to in terms of hard caps." Furthermore, framing their growth as a quote threat is deeply problematic. For these nations, growth is about survival and basic human dignity. The onus is on high-emitting countries to accelerate their own decarbonization so dramatically that it creates the atmospheric space for others to achieve a decent standard of living.
But there is no more atmospheric space. That is the fundamental scientific truth we are deliberately ignoring at our own peril. We are at the precipice. The carbon budget for 1.5 degrees is virtually exhausted. Waiting for a perfect funding mechanism to materialize before taking global unified action is a gamble we cannot afford to take. The two processes, funding from the North and commitments from the South, must happen in parallel, not sequentially. They must be part of the same single agreement.
Dr. Tanaka, you speak of this grand plan, but the political will in developed nations seems fractured at best. How can we expect universal commitments when the very nations meant to be funding the transition struggle to pass their own domestic climate legislation?
That political fragility is precisely why a universal framework is so critical. It allows international pressure and reciprocal agreements to bolster domestic policy. When a nation sees its economic competitors also committing, it makes it easier to justify the investment at home. A patchwork of exemptions creates the political excuse of, "Why should we act if they are not?" which is a death knell for progress.
That is a convenient political argument, but it ignores the economic reality. A commitment from a developing nation, made under duress and without funding, is merely paper. It won't be met because it can't be met. This focus on universal binding targets is an obsession of the developed world that prioritizes form over function, appearance over actual results. It is better to have a voluntary, well-funded plan that achieves real-world adaptation and targeted mitigation than a universally binding treaty that is ignored by necessity.
So you are willing to bet our collective future on the voluntary goodwill of nations? History shows us that voluntary, non-binding agreements in environmental matters have a very poor track record. The science demands certainty and quantifiable, verifiable reductions on a global scale, which is the very definition of a binding target.
We are nearing the end of our time. I would like to ask you both for a brief closing statement to summarize your positions. Ms. Sharma, you first.
The path to a stable climate cannot and will not be paved with injustice. To do so is to build a foundation on sand. Forcing developing nations into a framework designed by and for the wealthy world will not only fail, but will also breed resentment and shatter the very international cooperation we desperately need. The moral and practical imperative is clear. Historical polluters must lead with deep, drastic, and immediate emissions cuts at home. They must simultaneously provide the promised, substantial financial and technological support that has been pledged for years. True global solidarity is not about imposing uniform burdens. It is about acknowledging different realities and empowering every nation to follow a sustainable path that does not demand they sacrifice their fundamental right to development. Justice and sustainability are not mutually exclusive. They are, and must be, inextricably linked.
Thank you. Dr. Tanaka, your final thoughts?
We are all in the same boat, adrift in a rapidly rising tide. The boat does not care who is in first class or economy. Arguing about who drilled the first holes in the hull is a dangerous and tragic distraction when we should all be bailing water with every tool we have. The climate crisis is a uniquely unifying threat that demands a unified, albeit differentiated, response from every single one of us. To exempt any nation or bloc is to surrender to the physics of the problem, to admit defeat before we have truly fought. The challenge is not to punish developing countries, but to make climate action the most logical, profitable, and direct path to a resilient and prosperous future for them. Innovation, investment, and shared commitment are not idealistic dreams. They are our only pragmatic tools for survival.
Thank you both, Ananya Sharma and Dr. Kenji Tanaka, for a deeply insightful and challenging debate. You've laid bare the central tension between climate justice and the urgent, collective need for action. The question that remains for all of us is not whether we must act, but how we can do so together, equitably and effectively.